Good morning. I think some of the comments I'm going to make today will be very much in line with what you've already heard, but I hope I can bring a little bit of clarity to the world situation and at the same time a little bit of specific advice and counsel to the challenges that countries, whether it's the United States or Colombia, face as we enter an interesting era and period in the world of energy. But first, let me begin by expressing my compliments to all of you and to this country. I have had the opportunity in my previous jobs to do a small amount of work that related to Colombia, and more recently as a member of the board of a company that does a lot of business in this nation, a chance to get to know more about what's happened here. And I just last week happened to be in the state of California, and I was talking there with a former member of the U.S. House of Representatives who did a lot of work with Colombia during his tenure. And he made a point which I'll paraphrase, but which I equally agree with, and which I think is a reflection of the viewpoint from the policy side of the United States government, both the current as well as more recent administrations. And that is a feeling that this nation has, in a very short period of time, probably undergone the most positive transformational changes of any country in our hemisphere. And I think it is really a testament to all of you, of the people who have been in leadership over this last decade or so, that these accomplishments have taken place. And so it's a real honor for me to have the chance to be with you here today. Now let me talk a little bit about energy. Colombia, like a lot of other nations, is feeling the impact of the oil and gas price volatility which has taken place in the markets of the world. The impact has been felt, as you know, on varieties of levels, both here and around the planet. For companies, it has had a deep impact on profits. It's had a deep impact on their strategies. It's meant that with profits declining as a result of lower energy prices, there has been a retrenchment in terms of how much capital expenditure companies can afford to make in their energy exploration and development work. And it has changed priorities. And I want to come back to that to talk in some detail about how those changing priorities need to be addressed or need to be approached by countries who can be the hosts for significant energy infrastructure and exploration in the future. The other impact, of course, has been on the governments of countries who have been able to receive considerable revenues as a result of their energy development. Colombia is no different than many others. As the price of energy, as the price of oil and gas has declined, this nation's revenue stream as a result of that has been affected. And you all know better than me the implications of that on government policy making and on government budget making, and on how a country has to make adjustments. Again, I want to talk about that as I go forward, because I think the strategies in response need to be ones that not only take into account short-term, but also long-term challenges as well. But under any condition, because of these changes, the timing of this conference is, to me, excellent. And I'm both happy to be here and congratulate you on addressing these issues at such a critical time. Just to let you know that this is not the only conference of this type that's going on. Colombia is not alone in seeking strategic approaches to address the changing conditions in the energy sector. The participants here today are similar to ones that have been at conferences which I have attended and participated in, industry conferences and high-level corporate conferences that are also dealing with these exact same issues in light of what's been going on in the energy marketplace over the last 12 to 18 months. And so I think what we need to do today, what I'd like to do just to tell you how I will approach my remarks, is to begin just by talking about what the changes are and talk about basically what's going on in the world marketplace, at least why I think it's happening, what I think it suggests about the world market going forward. And then I want to talk about more specifically what it means for Colombia and for other energy producers. The threshold question I was asked to address here today was the question of whether or not what we're seeing is a typical energy cycle that has been long-standing in terms of the ups and downs of prices in the oil and gas marketplace, or whether there is in fact a new world in which we are finding ourselves. And I think the answer to that, which I will address momentarily, is that we are entering a somewhat new world. And it may not be a world that stays that way for a long period of time, but I think it's one that will stay with us at least for the foreseeable future. And so let's begin by talking about that world, or how we got to that point. The first thing is, I think that if you were to study the recent analysis of energy markets, the focus you would have found almost all analysts taking is on world supply, on the growth of U.S. energy production, on the growth of production in Russia, on the supply decisions, production decisions being made in places like Saudi Arabia, the Middle East, the OPEC producers, and so on. What's sort of been missed in this discussion, and which also needs to be taken into account, is the demand side of the equation. The world has gone through a period of slow economic growth. Yes, China in particular has had a very burgeoning economy, but even they've had a slowing down of their growth in recent years. And in Europe, growth has been flat. In the United States, growth has been, has been very, I would call it average, if not a little slower than average, starting with the Great Recession of 2008. And so as a result of this, we've seen a real change in terms of just the demand for energy on a global basis. And as that demand goes down, it obviously has an impact on price. Meanwhile, and it's been alluded to earlier by Secretary Smith, we've had a new perspective on energy taken by countries across the planet. And that perspective is to look at energy production, not just from the standpoint of commodity, but also from the standpoint of the environment. And I think a somewhat underappreciated impact in the energy market has been the introduction both of specific regulatory proposals that have become fashionable and popular across Europe, that are gaining support in other parts of the globe with respect to emissions. And in addition to that, a general awareness and concern on the part of citizens throughout the world to take actions consistent with good stewardship of the environment. In the United States, which has always historically been the really the bellwether country for energy consumption, we've seen very significant shifts on a variety of fronts in terms of how Americans deal with the issue of motor vehicle efficiency. we've seen a shift towards more fuel-efficient vehicles, some of it mandated by law, and some of it mandated by consumer decisions to seek vehicles, whether they are hybrids or electric vehicles, or in one way or another, less fuel-consuming vehicles than they have in the past. So when you couple all of this with an economy on a global basis that has not been as strong as it was in the previous few years before the recession of 2008, it has meant a global demand impact that's very significant. And so although the bigger story is supply, the story also is demand. And as demand has softened, it has had obviously significant impact on price. And I think it will continue, by the way, to have an impact for some time, even if it does not generate the kind of attention that the supply side of the equation has garnered in the last year and a half. But truly, supply is the bigger story. And what we have seen, of course, is the emergence of a number of new sources of energy production, particularly of oil and natural gas production, that have come about either because of new technologies such as hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling in the United States, the ability to access shale commodities that were resources either previously undiscovered or unreachable, and then the development of other regions of the world which are now beginning to emerge as potential sources of oil and gas development and are being and have been in recent years the targets of international energy investment. This, of course, has changed the equation in terms of price. It has also, of course, put a tremendous amount of focus on the production decision-making that takes place among the OPEC countries, and in particular, Saudi Arabia. Now, I would not profess to be as much of an expert or to know on a first-hand basis as much as the previous speaker, David Hobbs, does about the political thinking and the policy thinking in Saudi Arabia. But in Washington, I've had the occasion to have opportunities to discuss policy and ideas and get a feel for some of the thinking in the Saudi energy policy-making world, and more broadly in the rest of OPEC. And here's where things have changed. Historically, and I think back to the time when I was energy secretary, if there was prices were creeping either downward or upward, OPEC was in a position and was willing, and that meant the Saudis were willing to take action in terms of production levels to try to bring some balance back to the price. And so when prices were falling, the Saudis were willing, and OPEC was deciding to reduce production. And as those Saudi production reductions took place, prices were brought back into what was considered an acceptable range. And as David said, going into last November's meetings of OPEC, the expectation was that once again, OPEC would make production level decisions consistent with a price range that they felt would be desirable for their members going forward, except it didn't happen. And the reason it didn't happen has been attributed to a variety of factors. Some of them are, I think, kind of conspiracy theories that don't have much true support. Some of them are myths, some of them are speculation, but there are some that I think are pretty obviously factors that went into that decision. First and foremost, the Saudis previously were willing to shoulder almost all of the burden of production cuts because when they did that, as the price would readjust, they might lose some market share, but the market share they might lose was almost certainly going to be acquired by other members of the OPEC organization. But we live in a different world today. And what the Saudis have seen, what everybody has seen, is the emergence in America and Russia in other parts of the planet of new producing sources that in the world of high prices were beginning to really become profitable opportunities for investment. And as the OPEC countries were looking at this new world, they were forced to decide whether or not they wanted to shift market share, not just among themselves, but beyond OPEC and over to some of these new places where production was growing. And I think that the basic position of the Saudis and of OPEC has been that in the past, where we were talking about market share shifting among a club, we were no longer looking at that type of world, but rather foreseeing a world in which market share would be moving away from the OPEC countries in the event that they decided to decrease production. In my view, the Saudis did not see that as a particularly attractive option, not because they are not willing to be part of the sharing of production cuts, but because they were not prepared to be the first people to make this decision to shoulder these responsibilities. They wanted other people, they wanted other sources of production to be part of a global reduction in production. And in fact, by maintaining OPEC's production levels, that is what is taking place. I think the other point which David made that should be kept in mind is that there isn't a set of specific targets, such as American shale producers, who will be the ultimate targets of these actions. It's going to be the high-cost production resources. It is going to be, as David said, the deep well offshore expensive projects. It's going to be the Arctic. It's going to potentially be the tar sands in Canada. It's going to be places where production costs, exploration and development costs are very high. And I think that in a world in which there's going to be greater pressure downward on prices, that probably is an outcome that was inevitable. So in effect, that's, I think, what really has been taking place. And I think that the strategy, OPEC and the Saudis understand that the United States does not operate on a centralized decision-making basis when it comes to oil production. The government in Washington doesn't dictate to oil producers how much they can produce because it doesn't own the oil production sources. So the alternative to some type of an agreement is obviously to use the price signal. And by maintaining production at the levels that OPEC has, we're starting to see a ripple effect across the planet in terms of what is happening with production. So far it is working. And on the one hand, the Saudis and the other players in OPEC are proving that they are undaunted by the declining revenues that have come about as a result of lower prices, although I think that sooner or later it will begin to have significant impact on some of those countries. Already is certainly having impact on countries such as Venezuela. But they are coping with it as part of this longer-term policy they've adopted. Meanwhile, in the rest of the world, represented here today by a number of the major international companies, in every boardroom, in every management meeting, one of the top and most focused on issues is how do we reduce our costs? How do we bring the costs of our development in line with a price structure that is very radically different from where we saw it just a few years ago? And what that's going to mean, and probably the most important takeaway, is that in the United States and undoubtedly in other parts of the planet, we are going to see lower production in 2016 than we've seen this year. And that lower production, obviously combined with lower prices for the consumers, will have an impact on the market. It will change the psychology of the market. But that lower price and that lower production, from the point of view of the OPEC countries and of the Saudis, will be borne more broadly. It will be borne not just by them. And I think their strategy in that sense has been working. But the question we're left with is whether or not this is an aberrational, brief departure from what we've seen in recent years, or whether or not we are at a point where there's been a real new paradigm and a new world in which we have to make energy policy choices. Here's the way I see that. First, there's no way to change the fact that there are a lot of new emerging players in the world of energy production. The United States shale industry is not going to disappear. If anything, there will be new shale plays developed, new opportunities for development in regions of the United States that are just now coming to light. In addition, we're seeing places around the planet mentioned by some of the previous speakers that have not been significant sources of energy production, but which are now becoming part of the global energy production picture. West Africa beginning to emerge. We will soon see the results of the discussions about the Iran nuclear program bring Iran back into the participating world of global energy supply. At least initially, we estimate somewhere in the vicinity of 700,000 barrels a day added to the world market when sanctions are lifted. And whether it goes much higher will depend on investment, but clearly there's a certain level that will come online fairly quickly. Perhaps more slowly, but I think ultimately growth in the production in Iraq. And in addition to all of that, what I think we're going to see is that the new technologies, which in the United States have become sources of new production, the shale developments and so on, are going to now be explored and developed in other parts of the world as well. Particularly, I think, in Eastern Europe, potentially in China. Just in the last few weeks, I have had conversations with individuals and companies in both of those regions, and shale is certainly something coming into play there. So the supply side is not going to get reduced. We may have a reduction in production, but the number of sources of supply is going to, if anything, grow over the coming decade and beyond. And the other new thing, which I alluded to before, is the growing global focus on CO2 emissions, on the issues that relate to climate. And I'm not sure what the final results of that will be, because I think they probably will take a country-by-country approach. But almost certainly, collectively, any new regulations, any new policies, et cetera, are going to have the impact of suppressing demand growth, whether because consumers decide they don't want to contribute as much to the emission side of the picture, or because governments impose sanctions that cause that to happen in the form of some type of carbon taxation or carbon constraint. So you'll see more hybrid vehicles, you'll see more electric vehicles, you'll see innovators developing storage capacity that makes it more possible for vehicles in the electric car arena to be similar to, if not identical to, the capacities and abilities of vehicles that have traditionally frequented the highways of the world. And so when you add that to the UN efforts and so on, you're going to see a growth in the sources of supply. You're going to see a tamping down of the projected growth of demand, even as China and India and other emerging economies grow. And so I think that you're going to see a very substantial change in the demand-supply curves that we will encounter in the next few years. You know, if I had given this speech to you a few years ago, what would we be talking about? Well, we would be talking, I at least would be talking, about projected global growth in energy demand at a level that would be substantially higher than existing or projected reserves were likely to be able to meet. And we'd be talking about what can be done, whether it was in Colombia or it was in the hemisphere or it was in the world, to increase supply growth to meet these projected demand increases that were going to come about because emerging middle classes in developing countries were going to begin to be great consumers of energy, and particularly of oil and gas. That would have been the speech I'd have been presenting to you just probably 24 months ago. Today we have a whole different situation. Instead of a situation in which supply was projected to grow very fast and concern existed over whether demand could meet that supply, hence a world in which there would be a lot of upward pressure on prices, I think we're entering into a period, and I don't know how long this will last, where the number of potential sources of supply will be more than adequate to meet global demand. And therefore, the potential for more pressure, downward pressure on prices, I think, will be what we encounter at least for a fair number of years going forward. And so, as a result of that, you know, countries, whether it's the United States, it's Colombia, it's anyone, has to face the challenge of how do we react, how do we address this new world? What are we going to do to make our energy sector successful against the backdrop of a world in which prices will have a very great pressure on them in a downward direction? So here are some thoughts that I've had about how at least Colombia might want to look at these challenges. By no means do I profess to be an expert on the energy sector here. I hope these will be taken as the views of someone who is approaching this challenge with the best of intentions, but certainly not with the expertise that exists in this audience. But I think these principles will still be good ones to think about as you, either in your companies or on a broader basis among the association, or even more broadly at the governmental level, think about strategies for the years ahead. So let me begin with just some of the more specific things. First, it is very important and David alluded to this, to make the process of undertaking energy projects as efficient as possible, consistent with health, safety, and environmental concerns and policies. Here's the challenge Colombia has. In a world in which prices are high, where prices seem to have no limit in terms of how high they might go, global investors in the energy sector were willing to, consider almost any place and to invest almost any place because they had a very high probability of making profits in a very high price environment. But if we're in an environment in which prices are lower and where the pressure would be, if anything, for them to go even further down, it's a different story. And so then the investment becomes very, very cautious. And the caution brings about comparisons as to where risks are greater, where burdens are greater, where energy processes are more complicated. And so from the standpoint of Columbia, first and foremost should be the thought, how can we make our exploration and development more efficient, more attractive, and primarily simpler and easier to undertake than the other people competing for the same projects. And so the beginning point, and David mentioned this, is the whole process of the permitting and the feasibility of project development. If country A is a laborious, multi-year, difficult process, and country B is not, country B has a greater chance of attracting the investment dollar. And these relate to not just national level policies, but they also have to be looked at from the standpoint of more regional and local policies as well. If the ability to permit projects is complicated and expensive and long, whether it's some local rule or it's a national regulatory approach, it puts you in a difficult position versus places where that is not the case. Second, it is important to emphasize in this kind of environment low-cost operations and efficient operations at all levels of the production and exploration chain. Obviously, the international companies and the national companies who will be doing the work are going to insist that the people who are doing the work as subcontractors or energy service companies operate efficiently. I mean, that's part of any energy development. But it is, I think, important to reinforce this as strongly as possible. It's the countries who can provide the support services at all levels for energy development at a low cost but efficient and effective and safe manner will again have a very significant advantage over those who cannot. Third, it is important to focus on energy infrastructure and capability. At the end of the day, the ability to take product into the international market is a determining factor in where energy production investment will take place. And if the infrastructure of a country is not supportive of the transportation and movement of energy resources, it creates a disadvantage. Now, I am aware that a lot of progress has been made in terms of transportation infrastructure here, of internet infrastructure, et cetera. And all I'm really saying is I compliment those accomplishments and stress the importance of taking the same sort of philosophy and applying it to the energy infrastructure as well. The United States, frankly, has some very significant challenges facing it going forward. You probably watched in recent years this very extensive debate about whether or not the Keystone XL pipeline, which would allow Canadian and U.S. producers to move product to market, has been basically not approved. It's not been able to go forward. Now, some would argue that we don't need it. Some would say that we still haven't studied enough, although it's been studied quite substantially. But the bottom line is that there's issues about infrastructure. In the United States, we have a very old electricity grid. The U.S. was very fortunate. It began building its electricity grid before most countries. The problem is the same grid's still there. It's just older and less capable of meeting the demands placed upon it than was the case when it was built. And so countries who are expanding their electrification now actually will have stronger electrical infrastructure capabilities than many parts of America in the not too distant future. So infrastructure really matters. And having an energy infrastructure with great capabilities is a cornerstone, I think, of moving forward. Fourth is to recognize that the tax policies on the energy sector are going to be another way that investment differentiation takes place. If country A's tax policies and production sharing policies and so on are more onerous, burdensome, or costly than country B's, then in this world in which projects are going to be much more selectively decided, country B has an advantage. Obviously, against the backdrop of declining revenues, everybody's trying to figure out how do we make up for the loss. Obviously, in OPEC, they're working very hard at that. It's been a significant impact on a number of their countries, or the countries there. I know it's been an impact here. But bear in mind that in terms of the long-term production and revenue from energy projects, that the cost of doing business matters a great deal. And in a world in which companies cannot afford to undertake as many projects as at a high price level allowed them, then it's very pivotal to be competitive in terms of the policies that relate to tax and cost of business. Fifth is obviously the continuing efforts to try to eliminate the threats to the energy sector and really to the country more broadly that have occurred here with terrorists and guerrillas and so on in over a long period of time. I am not an expert on this subject, and I defer to the people of Colombia to decide what the best solutions are, but obviously since the energy sector has been affected by this a decline and elimination, hopefully at some point, of these kinds of threats makes a difference in terms of the calculation investors will make. And then finally, sixth, and here it's merely a compliment, not a recommendation, I think the policies of transparency, the policies of clear rules, the policies that give confidence to investors that a country understands how business works and how the rule of law works and how transparency makes a difference and how the risk of corruption has been eliminated is a huge advantage. Keep taking advantage of that, because I think Colombia is seen as a place where really it differentiates Colombia as a place where business is done in a way that is fair to those who are making these investments. And finally, I would say be creative. There are a lot of new technologies emerging that allow energy production to take place in places that didn't previously think they would be production sources. And whether it's the shale approach, it's LNG, some of the other specific things that have been discussed this morning and yesterday by speakers, be very open-minded about embracing a lot of different new ways to do business in the energy world. Because I think countries that demonstrate that kind of flexibility and that kind of receptivity are going to look much more attractive to investors than are going to be countries who say, no, we only do it a certain way, or we've proscribed a variety of things that could be major contributors to energy development. Those are my thoughts. And again, I defer to all of you who do business here and are more expert than me. But the perspective I'm trying to bring today, and I'll close on this, is the perspective of how I think energy companies are going to differentiate between opportunities in the next 5 to 10 years. I think they're going to, once you've gone through one of these low price periods, psychologically, you are going to spend a long period of time fearing their return. And even if demand starts to increase, even if prices start to stabilize and move upward, it will take quite a while before the psychology locks in that we have more confidence. And so in that period, I think decision-making is going to really focus on some of the things I've mentioned today as companies make ultimate final decisions as to where they're going to pursue their investments. You know, it's sort of an interesting thing. There are a lot of young analysts. One of the things I do in my professional work is to provide advice and counsel to energy analysts who work in investment firms, most of it being about what's going on in Washington and what we think is likely to take place there. And because most of the information they get relates to the dollars and cents and the quarterly reports and the bottom lines of companies, their thirst for this kind of Washington and policy and political information is quite great. As I've had these meetings in the last year or so, I've been struck by the fact that so many of these young analysts have never gone through the energy cycles that probably a lot of you have. This is the first time they've had to give advice and evaluate investments against the backdrop of a declining price market. And it's stunning to them because they never foresaw this happening. They never went through it before. And I promise you that just in the way that they're stunned by this development, it's going to translate into how the companies who they advise on their investments, how energy companies who have the same kind of young people now moving into significant positions without a lot of background and experience in a low price market, they're not going to quickly revert back in their thinking to the world before. They're going to operate within the world that now has shaken and in some cases caused significant losses to transpire in their organizations. And so that's why I'm really pushing today very hard on this issue of comparative advantage. And the comparative advantage that Columbia already has relates to the way the government has operated, the way the rules are followed, the transparency, the dramatic changes I alluded to at the beginning that have occurred over the last 10 years in this country, the leadership that's been offered by people who are committed to these things. And you've seen it in the growth of the energy production over the last decade or so. And the way to keep it moving, the way to benefit in a tough market is to show that in addition to the gains and progress that's already been made, more is on the way because you're addressing these second issues that now are coming up that are going to differentiate, that are going to give comparative advantage to Columbia over others who are seeking these investments. I think from everything I know that you have the capacity to have that comparative advantage, and I wish you the very best in your work and efforts to capitalize on an opportunity that I think really is very positive for you at this time. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Again, I'm honored to participate, and I thank you for having me today. Thank you.